My name is Sarah Bennett, and I'm 38 years old. I've spent my career as a freelance investigative journalist, chasing down stories that others wouldn't touch, exposing corruption, unmasking frauds, and giving voice to the voiceless. But nothing in my years of digging through archives or dodging angry sources prepared me for the betrayal that struck on Christmas Eve at Las Vegas Medical Center. I was sprawled on a hospital bed, my body writhing with pain from internal bleeding that demanded emergency surgery. My 3-year-old twins, Liam and Sophie, sat in the corner, clutching a frayed teddy bear, their tiny faces etched with worry. With no one else to turn to, I called my parents, Charles and Margaret, begging them to watch my kids while I faced a procedure that might leave them motherless. The video call connected, and my father's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "We're not dropping everything for you, Sarah," Charles said, his tone sharp and unyielding. "We're attending a charity art gala tonight. There's a $50,000 donation we can't miss. It's for a good cause." Margaret leaned in, her lips twisting into a sneer. "You've become such a burden, Sarah. We're retired. We deserve this. Not babysitting because you can't manage." Then they laughed, a cold, mocking sound that pierced my heart. A burden? I'd been sending them $3,000 a month for 4 years, even after my husband David died in a car crash 8 months ago, leaving me to raise our twins alone. That money was my sweat, my sacrifice, and they threw it back in my face. Tears burned my eyes as the pain in my abdomen flared, but their indifference hurt more. They didn't ask about my condition, didn't care that my twins might lose me forever. All they saw was their precious Gala. I ended the call, my hands trembling as Nurse Hannah adjusted the monitors beside me. Her kind eyes met mine, and she placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "I can't believe they do this," she whispered. "Let me call Claire. She's a nanny who works with kids in crisis. She'll take care of your little ones." I nodded, too stunned to speak, but a spark ignited inside me. My parents thought they could abandon me, steal my money, and walk away with their secrets intact. They didn't know who I was. I'm an investigative journalist. I've spent years uncovering lies and exposing the truth. They ditched my twins for a fake charity gala and called me a burden. But what they didn't expect was that I'd dig into their past. That night, as I lay in agony, a nurse slipped a worn envelope under my pillow. Inside was a clipping from a 20-year-old article I'd written as a rookie reporter, hinting at my father's shady dealings with a missing art patron. The clue set my mind racing. This wasn't just about surviving surgery. It was about unraveling a family mystery that would change everything. As I lay in that hospital bed, waiting for the surgery that could either save me or leave my twins without a mother, my mind raced back through the years. The pain in my abdomen was excruciating, but the sting of my parents' betrayal cut deeper. I'd always known Charles and Margaret favored my younger sister Lauren, who was 35 and a rising star in the art world. Growing up, Lauren could do no wrong in their eyes. Her paintings were hung proudly in our living room, her gallery openings celebrated with lavish parties, while my achievements as a journalist were barely acknowledged. When I graduated college with honors in journalism, they didn't even show up to the ceremony because Lauren had a minor art show that same weekend. When I married David, they complained the venue was too far from their house in Reno. And when Liam and Sophie were born, they visited just once, claiming the twins were too noisy for their liking. David had been my anchor through it all. He understood the pain of family neglect, having been estranged from his own mother for years. "We'll build our own family," he'd say, "one that knows how to love without conditions." And we did, creating a warm home filled with laughter and acceptance. But 8 months ago, a drunk driver stole him from us, leaving me to raise our twins alone while battling grief and exhaustion. Despite my loss, I kept supporting my parents financially. I sent $3,000 a month, every month for 4 years, even after David's death drained our savings. I'd been a freelance journalist, taking on grueling assignments to make ends meet, often working late into the night after the twins were asleep. I increased the payments when Charles and Margaret claimed they were struggling with retirement costs, wanting to be the daughter they could rely on. I thought families should stick together no matter what. How naive I was. Looking back, there were signs I'd ignored. My parents had always been obsessed with appearances, especially in the art community. They'd throw extravagant parties, buy overpriced sculptures, and boast about their connections to elite collectors. I thought they were just eccentric, but now their refusal to help me for a charity gala raised red flags. What kind of charity demanded a $50,000 donation on Christmas Eve? And why was it more important than their grandchildren? As a journalist, I'd learned to trust my instincts. And something about their excuse didn't add up. I remembered a story I'd started 15 years ago when I was a rookie reporter, fresh out of college. I'd been investigating a string of art frauds in Nevada, focusing on a shady organization posing as a charity. One name kept popping up in my research: a man linked to a missing art patron who vanished after a gala in 2004. That man was my father, Charles Bennett. I confronted him about it back then, showing him my notes and the interviews I'd conducted with former art dealers. He'd laughed it off, calling my suspicions childish, and insisted the organization was legitimate. Margaret had backed him up, saying I was embarrassing the family with my conspiracy theories. They pressured me to drop the story, threatening to cut me off if I didn't. I was young, broke, and desperate for their approval, so I shelved the article, burying it in a box of old files. But I never forgot the look in Charles's eyes that day, a mix of fear and anger that told me I'd stumbled onto something real. Over the years, I'd pushed it to the back of my mind, convincing myself it was a coincidence. Now, lying in that hospital bed, I realized I'd been wrong to let it go. The $3,000 I sent each month wasn't just supporting their retirement. It was funding something darker. I remembered snippets of conversations over the years. Charles mentioning investments in art charities. Margaret boasting about exclusive galas they'd been invited to. They'd always framed it as philanthropy. But what if it was a front? What if the money I'd been sending was tied to the same organization I'd investigated all those years ago? The thought sent a chill down my spine. I'd been so focused on being a good daughter, on keeping the peace, that I'd ignored the clues staring me in the face. My parents weren't just selfish, they were hiding something, and their refusal to help me during my surgery was the final straw. I glanced at Liam and Sophie, their small hands clutching the teddy bear as they whispered to each other. They'd already lost their father, and now they might lose me too. The thought of leaving them with people who saw them as burdens, who might be entangled in something sinister, was unbearable. I knew what I had to do. I'd spent my career uncovering the truth, shining a light on the darkest corners of people's lives. Now, it was time to turn that light on my own family. I didn't know what I'd find, but I was certain of one thing. The charity gala they'd chosen over me was no coincidence. It was a thread, and I was going to pull it until their secrets unraveled. My parents thought they could abandon me and walk away with my money and their lies intact. They didn't know I'd spent my life chasing the truth, and I wasn't about to stop now, not when my children's future was at stake. This wasn't just about surviving surgery. It was about uncovering a mystery that had been buried for 20 years. One that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. The operating room lights were blinding as they wheeled me in, the antiseptic smell filling my lungs with every shallow breath. My body felt like it was being torn apart, the internal bleeding sapping my strength, but my mind was sharper than ever. Nurse Hannah had stayed by my side, her calm voice guiding me through the pre-surgery checks, while Claire arrived just in time to take Liam and Sophie to a small room down the hall. I watched them go, their little hands waving goodbye, and a lump rose in my throat. I didn't know if I'd see them again, but I knew I couldn't leave them in the hands of Charles and Margaret, not after what they'd done. The anesthesia began to pull me under, but my last thought was of that envelope, the one slipped under my pillow by an unknown nurse. It was a clue, a spark in the darkness, and I clung to it as the world faded away. The surgery was a success, though it left me weak and disoriented when I woke up 3 days later. My abdomen throbbed with every movement, a constant reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. Claire had been a godsend, staying with the twins in my hospital room during the day and taking them to my apartment at night. She sang them lullabies, played games with them, and kept them from seeing the full extent of my pain. Nurse Hannah checked on me regularly, her kindness a stark contrast to the coldness of my parents. I owe them both more than I could ever repay. But my thoughts kept drifting back to that envelope. It sat on the bedside table now, its edges worn, taunting me with its secrets. With trembling hands, I opened it again, pulling out the clipping I'd written 15 years ago as a rookie journalist. The headline read, "Art patron vanishes after Gala. Fraud suspected." My byline was there, bold and naive, beneath a grainy photo of a man named Victor Lang, a wealthy collector who disappeared in 2004 after attending a charity art event in Reno. My notes detailed whispers of a fraudulent organization posing as a benefactor for struggling artists, and one name kept surfacing: Charles Bennett, my father. I'd interviewed a former gallery owner back then who hinted that Charles had been involved in shady dealings. But my parents shut it down. They'd called my reporting reckless, pressured me to drop the story, and I'd caved, too young and too eager for their approval to fight back. Now, staring at those faded words, I felt a surge of anger. What if they'd been lying to me all along? I pulled out my phone, ignoring the flood of missed calls from Charles and Margaret, and started piecing things together. As a journalist, I'd learned to follow the money, and the $3,000 I'd sent them monthly for 4 years was a trail worth following. I logged into my bank app, my fingers shaky but determined, and reviewed the transfer history. The payments had stopped after my last message cutting them off, but something caught my eye. An old note I'd added 2 years ago when they asked for an increase. For charity donations, Margaret had said, her voice dripping with pride. Charity? The gala they'd attended instead of helping me was tied to the same organization I'd investigated as a rookie. My heart pounded. What if the money I'd sent wasn't supporting their retirement, but funding a scam? I called Lauren that afternoon, my voice hoarse from the pain On the second ring, her tone cautious. I told her about the surgery, the twins, and my parents' refusal. Watching her reaction through the video call, her face softened, then hardened as I mentioned the gala. I've been wondering about their finances, too, she admitted. They've been bragging about donations to some art charity. But I saw a bill for a luxury cruise last month. It doesn't add up. I showed her the article, clipping, and her eyes widened. You think Dad's still involved in something like this? She asked. I nodded. I need your help, Lauren. I'm going to dig deeper, and I can't do it alone. The next day, still confined to my hospital bed, I began my investigation. I used my laptop, propped up on a tray, to search old archives. My journalist instincts kicked in as I cross-referenced the charity's name with Victor Lang's disappearance. A blurry photo surfaced of Charles at a 2004 gala, standing beside Lang, his smile tight and forced. I dug further, finding a police report marked inactive that mentioned a $200,000 withdrawal from Lang's account days before he vanished, linked to an art charity Charles had chaired. My breath caught. Could my father have been part of a cover-up? The thought made my stomach turn, but it also fueled me. I recorded a voice memo detailing my findings, knowing I'd need evidence if I confronted them. Then came the turning point. A nurse, not Hannah, delivered my lunch tray with a second envelope tucked beneath it. Inside was a handwritten note, and the ink smudged but legible. Your father knows more than he's saying. Check the 2004 Gala guest list. No signature, no hint of the sender, but it was enough to set my pulse racing. I searched online for the Gala records, my hands trembling as I scrolled through a digitized guest list. There it was. Charles Bennett, listed alongside Margaret and a dozen other names, including a man later convicted of art fraud. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was uglier than I'd feared. My parents hadn't just abandoned me for a gala, they'd been using my money to prop up a lie, one that might have cost a man his life. I glanced at Liam and Sophie, now napping on a fold-out cot Claire had arranged. They were my reason to keep going, my reason to uncover the truth. The surgery had saved my life, but it was this investigation that would save my soul. My parents thought they could dismiss me as a burden, but they didn't know I spent me chasing stories like this. And they'd opened a door to their past, and I was walking through it, armed with my pen and my resolve. This wasn't just about cutting ties. It was about exposing a conspiracy that had haunted my family for decades. And I wouldn't stop until the truth was laid bare. The hospital room felt like a war zone as I pieced together the clues from my bed. The steady beep of the monitors, blending with the rush of my own heartbeat. 4 days had passed since my surgery, and though my body was still weak, my mind was racing at full speed. The second envelope with its cryptic note about the 2004 Gala guest list had ignited a fire in me that no amount of pain medication could dampen. I'd spent the night poring over my laptop, the screen casting a ghostly glow across my face as I dug deeper into the past. My parents, Charles and Margaret, thought they could abandon me and my twins for a fake charity gala, but they didn't know I was about to turn their lives into headlines. The first breakthrough came when I cross-referenced the guest list with public records. Charles Bennett was there, his name bolded beside Margaret's, alongside a man named Richard Holt, a known art fraudster, convicted in 2006 for a $5 million scam. Holt had served 3 years before disappearing from the public eye, but the Gala connection sent a chill down my spine. I remembered Lauren's comment about their finances not adding up, and it clicked. The $3,000 I'd sent them monthly wasn't just supporting their retirement, it was funding a revival of Holt's scheme, disguised as a charitable art organization. My money had been laundering their guilt for years. I called Lauren again that afternoon, my voice steady, despite the ache in my side. She answered quickly, her face etched with concern. I told her about the guest list, the fraud conviction, and my suspicion that Charles was still involved. Her eyes widened as I showed her the screen. I've heard Dad mention Richard Holt before, she said, her voice low. A few months ago, He bragged about reconnecting with an old friend from the art world. I thought it was just nostalgia. I nodded, my journalist instincts kicking in. We need to dig deeper. Can you check their house for any documents when they're out? Lauren hesitated, then agreed. I'll go tomorrow. They're at another gala tonight. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed with a flood of missed calls and messages from Charles and Margaret. The first text from my father read, Sarah, this financial cutoff is unacceptable. We need that money to cover our commitments. The next was from Margaret, pleading, we've supported you your whole life, and this is how you repay us? Then came the anger. You're destroying our reputation with this stunt. Not once did they ask about my surgery, my recovery, or the twins. Their silence on my condition was deafening, but it fueled my resolve. I recorded their messages, knowing they'd be evidence if I needed to expose them. The next day, Lauren called back, her voice shaking with excitement. I found something, Sarah. In Dad's study, there was a locked drawer. I picked it with a hairpin, and inside were letters from Richard Holt, dated last year, asking for additional funding for the charity. There's also a ledger with your name next to large withdrawals. My heart pounded. Did you take pictures? I asked. Yes, she said, sending them over. The images showed a detailed log of my payments, funneled into accounts tied to the charity, alongside notes about Acagna covering past debts. One entry mentioned Victor Lang, the missing art patron from my old article, with a chilling line, ensure silence remains. I contacted a former colleague, Tom Grayson, a retired police detective who'd worked with me on fraud cases. He agreed to meet me via video call that evening. I showed him the photos and the guest list, explaining my theory that Charles had been part of a cover-up after Lane's disappearance, possibly even his death. Tom's face grew serious. This could be bigger than you think, Sarah. If Holt's back, and your father's involved, it might tie to an unsolved homicide. I'll run the names through the system. He promised to get back to me within 48 hours, but the wait felt like an eternity. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the twins sleeping soundly thanks to Claire's lullabies. My mind replayed every memory of Charles and Margaret, searching for clues I'd missed. I remembered a late-night call 2 years ago when Charles had slurred his words, mentioning a favor he'd done for Holt to protect the family. At the time, I'd brushed it off as a drunken rambling, but now it felt like a confession. The charity gala they'd chosen over me wasn't just a selfish act, it was a meeting to cover their tracks. My money had been their shield, and Victor Lang's disappearance was the shadow they'd hidden behind. The next morning, Tom called with news that turned my world upside down. Sarah, I found a sealed file on Lang's case. It was closed due to lack of evidence, but there's a witness statement from 2005 claiming Charles was the last person seen with him at the gala. The witness died in a suspicious car accident months later. My breath caught. And Holt? I asked. He's been spotted in Reno recently, under a new alias. Tom said, if your father's still in contact, this could reopen a murder investigation. I thanked him, my mind reeling. This wasn't just about money or neglect. It was about a crime my family had buried for 20 years, and I was the one holding the shovel. I knew I had to confront them, but first, I needed more proof. I asked Claire to take the twins to a park for a few hours, giving me space to work. I contacted an old source, a gallery owner named Elena, who tipped me off about Holt years ago. She agreed to meet me secretly at a diner near the hospital. Disguised with a scarf and sunglasses, I hobbled out, my incision still tender, and met her in a booth. Elena's eyes widened as I showed her the ledger photos. I always suspected Charles, she whispered. After Lang vanished, he sold off a rare painting that matched Lang's collection. The proceeds vanished into that Charlie Bassir's. She handed me a USB drive with encrypted files, promising they'd prove the fraud. I say, "Be careful, Sarah. They'll come for you if they know." Back in my room, I plugged in the drive, my hands shaking as I decrypted on the files. They revealed bank transfers, fake receipts, and a memo signed by Charles authorizing the sale of Lang's painting. The evidence was overwhelming, but so was the danger. My parents weren't just negligent, they were criminals, and I was about to blow their world apart. The twins' future depended on it, and I wouldn't let their legacy be tainted by a lie. This investigation had just begun, and I was ready to follow it wherever it led, even if it meant facing the darkest corners of my own family. The hospital released me a week after my surgery, my body still aching with every step, but my resolve stronger than ever. Claire had been a lifeline, caring for Liam and Sophie with a tenderness my parents had never shown, while I pieced together the evidence that would bring Charles and Margaret to their knees. The USB drive from Elena sat heavy in my bag, its encrypted files a ticking time bomb of truth. I'd spent the last 2 days transcribing the ledger, cross-checking bank records, and drafting an article that would expose their fraud. My hands shook as I saved the final draft, knowing the next move would change everything. I was no longer just a daughter seeking justice. I was a journalist, ready to confront the criminals who raised me. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. 2 days after my release, a sharp knock echoed through my apartment door. I peeked through the peephole and saw Charles and Margaret standing there, their faces tight with attention. Liam and Sophie were napping, thanks to Claire's watchful eye, so I opened the door just enough to speak. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Charles pushed forward, his usual commanding presence diminished. "Sarah, we need to talk about this financial nonsense. We're in deep trouble because you stopped the payments?" Margaret nodded, her eyes darting nervously. "We've committed to the charity Gala, and without your money, we can't cover our obligations. You have to help us." I stepped back, letting them in, but kept my distance. "Obligations?" I said, my tone icy. "You mean the fake charity you've been funneling my money into for years?" Charles's face flushed, and Margaret's hand flew to her chest. "What are you talking about?" she stammered. I pulled out my laptop, opening the file with the ledger and bank transfers. "I'm talking about this," I said, turning the screen toward them. $3,000 a month for 4 years, laundered through your so-called charity, linked to Richard Holt and the disappearance of Victor Lang. I've got proof, including a memo signed by you, Charles, authorizing the sale of Lang's painting. Charles's jaw tightened, and he tried to laugh it off. "This is absurd, Sarah. You're imagining things. That charity is legitimate, and Lang's disappearance was a tragedy, not our fault." I shook my head, pulling out my phone to play the recording of their mocking laughter from the hospital call. "Legitimate? You called me a burden while I was bleeding out, choosing your Gala over my life. And now I know why. You've been covering up a crime, and my money was your shield." Margaret sank onto the couch, her hands trembling. "We didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered. "It started as a way to protect the family." "Protect the family?" I snapped, my voice rising. "You protected yourselves while letting an innocent man vanish. I've spoken to Elena, a gallery owner who remembers Charles selling Lang's painting after he disappeared. I've got a USB with encrypted files proving the fraud, and I'm ready to send it to every major newspaper in the country." Charles lunged forward, his face red with rage. You wouldn't dare ruin us like that. Think of Lauren. Think of your children. I stood my ground, my heart pounding. Lauren knows the truth, and my children deserve a mother who isn't tied to criminals. You've left me no choice. The room fell silent, the weight of my words settling over them. Margaret buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly, while Charles paced, his mind clearly racing for an escape. "What do you want, Sarah?" he finally asked, his voice low. "An apology? Money? We can negotiate?" I crossed my arms. My decision clear. "I want you to turn yourselves in. Cooperate with the police. Admit your role in Lang's disappearance. And let the law handle it. If you don't, I'll publish this story myself, and you'll face the consequences alone." Margaret looked up, tears streaking her face. "We'll lose everything. Our home, our reputation." I nodded. "You should have thought of that before you used my money to bury your guilt." Charles stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping. "You don't understand the pressure we were under. Holt threatened us after Lang vanished. We had to keep paying to stay silent." I narrowed my eyes. "Silence bought with my money, while you let me struggle to raise my twins alone?" "No, I understand perfectly. You chose greed over family, and now you'll face the music." I picked up my phone, dialing Tom Grayson, the retired detective I'd worked with. "Tom, it's Sarah. I've got the evidence on the Lang case. My parents are ready to talk." Charles's face paled as Tom's voice crackled through the speaker, agreeing to meet us at the station. Before they left, Margaret grabbed my arm, her grip desperate. "Please, Sarah, don't do this. We're still your parents." I pulled away, my voice firm. "Parents don't abandon their children in their darkest hour. You lost that title when you chose a Gala over my life. Go with Tom, and maybe you can redeem yourselves by telling the truth." They shuffled out, escorted by Claire, who'd returned with the twins. Liam ran to me, his small arms wrapping around my legs, and I held him tight, knowing I'd made the right choice. The showdown was over, but the battle for justice had just begun. My parents thought they could manipulate me forever, but they didn't know I'd spent my life uncovering stories like this. Their reign of lies was crumbling, and I was the one holding the pen that would write their end. The next morning, news broke that Charles and Margaret Bennett had been taken into custody, their home raided by police. The story spread like wildfire, with headlines screaming about the art fraud and the reopened Lang case. I watched from my apartment, the twins playing nearby, as reporters camped outside my parents' empty house. Lauren called, her voice a mix of shock and relief. "They confessed to everything, Sarah. The police found documents linking Holt to Lang's disappearance. You did it." I smiled, but the victory felt hollow. This wasn't just about exposing them. It was about freeing myself from the shadow they'd cast over my life. The truth was out. And now I could focus on the future. One where my children would grow up knowing their mother fought for them, no matter the cost. With Charles and Margaret in custody, the chaos that followed felt like a whirlwind I could barely keep up with. News outlets buzzed with the story of their arrest, linking them to the art fraud scandal and the reopened investigation into Victor Lang's disappearance. Reporters camped outside my apartment, their cameras flashing as I shielded Liam and Sophie from the spotlight. I'd spent my career chasing stories, but being the center of one was a new kind of pressure. My incision still ached, a constant reminder of the surgery that had nearly taken my life, but I felt lighter than I had in years. The truth was out, and with it, the weight of my parents' lies had begun to lift. 2 weeks after their arrest, I received a letter from Margaret, delivered through Lauren. The envelope was plain, her handwriting shaky, and I hesitated before opening it. I sat at my kitchen table, the twins napping in their room, and unfolded the single sheet of paper. "Dear Sarah," it began. "I've had time to reflect in this cold cell, and I see now the depth of our betrayal. We were selfish, driven by greed and fear, and we used your money to cover our shame. I'm so sorry for failing you. As a mother, for choosing that Gala over you and the twins. Charles is cooperating with the police, telling them everything about Lang and Holt. We've lost everything. Our home, our status. But losing you hurts most. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope one day you'll let us prove we can change. The letter ended with a plea to see Liam and Sophie, to be part of their lives again. I set the letter down, my emotions a tangled mess. Part of me wanted to believe her, to see the mother I'd always longed for in those words. But another part, the journalist, who'd uncovered their lies, questioned her sincerity. Was this genuine remorse or another attempt to manipulate me? Lauren came over that evening, her face softer than I'd seen in years. Mom wrote to me too, she said, sitting across from me with a cup of tea. She's broken, Sarah. Dad's confession has shattered her, but she's starting therapy in jail. They both lost everything. Their house was seized, and they're living in a halfway house now. I nodded, my gaze drifting to the letter. I don't know if I can trust this, I admitted. They've lied to me my whole life. We decided to meet them, but on my terms. A week later, I arranged a visit at a quiet cafe near my new apartment, a place Claire had recommended for its privacy. Liam and Sophie stayed with Claire for the afternoon. I wasn't ready for them to see their grandparents yet. Charles and Margaret arrived, looking smaller than I remembered. Charles's confident posture was gone, replaced by a slouched weariness, and Margaret's designer clothes had been swapped for a simple sweater and jeans. We sat in a corner booth, the air thick with tension. "Thank you for meeting us," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "We've done terrible things, Sarah. We let Holt pull us in his schemes, and when Lang threatened to expose us, Charles panicked. We didn't mean for him to disappear, but we didn't stop it either." Charles looked down, his hands clasped tightly. "I've told the police everything," he said quietly. "Holtz orchestrated Lang's disappearance, but I helped cover it up. I sold his painting to pay off debts, and we've been paying Holt ever since to keep him quiet. Your money kept us afloat." I listened, my heart heavy but unmoved. "You chose silence over justice," I said, "and you chose a Gala over my life. I can't erase that." Margaret reached for my hand, but I pulled back. "I'm not ready to forgive," I continued, "but I'll give you a chance to prove you've changed. You'll cooperate fully with the police and the press. I'm writing a series on this case, and I expect your honesty. If you show remorse through actions, not words, we can talk about supervised visits with the twins." They nodded, their eyes filled with a mix of shame and hope. As we parted, Charles whispered, "We'll do whatever it takes, Sarah." I walked away, feeling a strange calm. The meeting wasn't about forgiveness. It was about setting boundaries. I'd spent my life chasing their approval, but now I was the one in control. Back home, I hugged Liam and Sophie, their laughter filling the void my parents had left. Lauren stayed for dinner, and we talked about the future, her art career, my writing, and the family we were rebuilding. The road to redemption was long, but I was ready to walk it on my terms. The weeks following my meeting with Charles and Margaret at the cafe felt like stepping into a new life, one where I was finally free to define my own path. The media storm around their arrest had calmed, but the impact of their confession rippled through our family and the art world. Charles had kept his word, cooperating fully with the police, providing names, dates, and financial records that led to the arrest of Richard Holt, the mastermind behind Victor Lang's disappearance. Holt was charged with fraud, extortion, and suspected homicide after new evidence surfaced linking him to Lang's death. Margaret, meanwhile, had taken a plea deal, testifying against Holt in exchange for a reduced sentence. They'd both been to 2 years in a minimum security facility, a small price for the decades of lies they'd lived. Their once lavish home in Reno was sold off to pay restitution to Lang's family, and what little remained of their assets went to legal fees. Margaret had taken a job in the prison library, while Charles worked in the facility's maintenance crew, a far cry from their days of champagne galas and art auctions. Lauren kept me updated, her visits to them revealing a slow shift in their demeanor. They're humbled, she told me, during one of her weekly dinners at my new apartment. Mom talks about you and the twins all the time, and Dad started writing letters to Lang's family, apologizing for his role. I listened, my heart softening slightly, but I wasn't ready to let them back into our lives fully. Their actions had to speak louder than their words, and I was watching closely. While they faced the consequences of their past, I turned my focus to building a future for Liam and Sophie. The twins were thriving, their laughter filling our new 3-bedroom apartment in a quiet Las Vegas neighborhood. I'd used the equity from selling my old place to buy this one, a cozy space with a small backyard where the twins could play. Claire still helped with childcare 3 days a week, her presence a steady comfort. As I balanced recovery with work, the surgery had left me weaker than I'd expected, but each day I grew stronger, both physically and emotionally. I'd started a new project, a series of investigative articles about the art fraud scandal, using my parents' story as a cautionary tale. The first piece, published in a national outlet, went viral, earning me a wave of messages from readers who'd been victims of similar scams. The articles didn't just bring attention to the case, they opened doors I hadn't anticipated. A publisher approached me to write a book, a memoir, weaving my personal journey with the investigation into Lang's disappearance. I signed the deal, using the advance to start a small foundation for victims of financial fraud, a passion project inspired by the countless emails I'd received. One reader, a woman named Diana, reached out to share her story of losing her savings to a fake charity. We met for coffee, and her gratitude for my work inspired me to expand the foundation, hosting workshops to educate others on spotting scams. It felt like a way to turn my pain into purpose, a legacy for Liam and Sophie to be proud of. My career wasn't the only thing flourishing. Lauren had become a true sister, not just a shadow of our parents' favoritism. She started spending weekends with us, teaching the twins to paint with watercolors, their tiny hands smudging bright colors across paper. We'd laugh over dinner, sharing stories of our childhood that didn't hurt anymore. And I saw a new side of her, one untainted by Charles and Margaret's manipulations. She'd even started her own art therapy program for kids, inspired by the twins' resilience. "You've changed everything, Sarah," she said one evening, watching Liam and Sophie chase each other around the backyard. I never realized how much Mom and Dad held us back until you broke free. The neighborhood we'd moved into welcomed us with open arms. Neighbors brought over casseroles when we settled in, and a local play group invited the twins to join, giving them friends their age for the first time. I joined a support group for single parents, introduced by Nurse Hannah, who'd become a friend after my hospital stay. The group met weekly via Zoom, allowing me to connect with others who understood the ache of raising children alone. Through them, I met a widower named Mark, whose quiet strength reminded me of David, We'd started chatting over coffee after meetings, a tentative friendship forming, though I wasn't ready for more just yet. For the first time since David's death, I felt a glimmer of hope that I might not always be alone. 6 months after the arrests, I received a call from Tom Grayson, the retired detective who'd helped me with the case. "They found Lang's remains, Sarah," he said, his voice heavy but relieved. "Buried in a lot Holt owned in Reno. Your parents' testimony led us straight to it." The news hit me like a wave, relief and sorrow crashing together. Victor Lang's family could finally grieve, and justice had been served, but the cost had been high. I wrote a final article dedicating it to Lang and donated the proceeds to his family's charity for missing persons. It was my way of closing the chapter, of honoring the man whose disappearance had haunted my family for 2 decades. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the twins play under the setting sun, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Charles and Margaret's shadow no longer loomed over me. I'd built a life rooted in truth, surrounded by a community that chose love over greed. Redemption wasn't just about their change, it was about mine. I'd transformed from a daughter desperate for approval into a mother who fought for justice, a journalist who turned pain into power. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. I was exactly where I belonged. Not because anyone had given me permission, but because I'd earned it through the ashes of their lies. Looking back, I never imagined my parents' betrayal would lead me to uncover a mystery that changed my life and brought justice to a family long forgotten. I turned their lies into my strength, building a future for Liam, Sophie, and myself, surrounded by a community that truly cares. This journey taught me that redemption starts with facing the truth, no matter how painful. Have you uncovered a family mystery or fought for justice? Share your story below, and let's inspire each other. If this resonated with you, hit subscribe and ring the bell for more stories of courage and renewal.